Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to the HRB-TMRN webinars. You're welcome to join us today. We're online for the next hour. If we have any problems throughout the broadcast today, if you could let us know in the chat box. We have had a couple of problems with audio in the past, so if you could let us know in the chat box and we'll do our best to sort that problem out for you. So today we're very lucky to have Laura Flight with us. Laura is a research associate in the Health Economics and Statistics at the School of Health Related Research, or SHAR, at the University of Sheffield. Laura is interested in innovative approaches to design and conduct in clinical trials, and with an emphasis on how novel statistical methods can be applied in practice. In 2016, Laura was awarded a National Institute of Health Research Doctoral Research Fellowship exploring the use of health economics and their design, monitoring and analysis in adaptive clinical trials. She's currently co-leading the Economic Adaptive Trial Design, or ENACT, project, exploring how value-based adaptive clinical trial design can be used in the efficient delivery of NIHR research. So it's our absolute pleasure to welcome you today, Laura, as our speaker. And I think that your topic is within the area of adaptive clinical trial design is perhaps more important now than ever has been in the face of the challenges we have with coronavirus and the issues that's brought to the trial community. So I'm really delighted to welcome you. I'm going to hand over to you now in a moment, Laura, but just before I do, if I could remind everyone that as the presentation is going on and you have any questions, if you could type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you hover over the bottom there, you'll find the toolbar. So if you could put a question perhaps in the chat screen or in the Q&A box, and we can pick them up and I'll put them to Laura at the end, because we're going to have about 15 minutes at the end of the session just to go through any questions you might have. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about some of my PhD research on the use of health economics in the design and analysis of adaptive clinical trials. So just to start off with, I'd just like to make a few acknowledgements. So this research was funded as part of an NIHR doctoral fellowship, and I also used some data from the CAPTUS pilot trial, which was also NIHR funded. So just the usual disclaimer that all the views are my own in this presentation. I would also just like to take the opportunity to thank my supervisors and members of a public advisory group who have all sort of supported me throughout this fellowship. And so I thank you to them and thank you for their contributions to the work that I will be presenting today. So I'm going to start off by giving a bit of background to the research project to hopefully put it into context and highlight why I thought it was important, an important area of research. I'll then briefly describe a review of current practice to help to understand how adaptive designs and health economics are currently used in practice. I'll then summarise a qualitative study that aims to try and understand what stakeholder views were towards the use of these methods. And I'll then focus on two specific issues. So first, thinking about any adjustments that we need to make to analyses that follow a group sequential design, which is a type of adaptive trial. And then think about opportunities to use health economics to help design and guide the design of group sequential trials. And at the end, I'll make some recommendations based on the things that I've learned as I've gone through the project to help researchers thinking about using health economics in their adaptive clinical trials. So just to start off with a bit of background, as I'm sure you're aware, healthcare systems around the world have limited resources for funding healthcare interventions, such as new drugs, and for funding health research, such as new clinical trials. And many decision makers try and prioritise those treatments that give us the biggest improvements in health for the money that they're spending. And to make these types of decisions, they often rely on research, such as clinical trials, to help inform those decisions about which treatments should be made available to patients. And so the methods of health economics play a really important role in this decision-making process, because they provide us with the tools that help us to understand and sort of quantify how we can maximise health gains for the money that we're spending. So I'm interested in two aspects of health economics. The first is centred on the methods of economic evaluation, which is understanding and calculating the cost effectiveness of an intervention. So for example, is our new drug cost effective compared to usual care, thinking about how it improves patients' quality of life, but also balancing that against how much it actually costs to implement in practice. I'm also interested in value of information analysis methods that think about the cost effectiveness of research. So for example, is it cost effective to run a new clinical trial? Thinking about what we will learn from that trial and the benefits of conducting that trial balanced against the costs associated with conducting that research. So this is sort of an overview of the healthcare decision-making process. And we can see that cost effectiveness comes into play at 2 key points. At the start of the process, when we're thinking about which types of research to conduct and how to allocate our research budget. And so we can think about the cost effectiveness of research when we're thinking about funding decisions. So funding panels might think about whether a particular research design or a particular proposal is value for money. And in my research, my focus is on clinical trials. And clinical trials are often used as a vehicle for collecting evidence of clinical effectiveness of an intervention, but also cost effectiveness of an intervention as well. And this information is used by clinical decision makers, such as the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, to help them inform recommendations about which treatments should be made available to patients on the NHS. So as I've mentioned, my research is focusing on clinical trials, but traditional clinical trials, so fixed design trials, can often be quite slow and quite costly to conduct. And researchers have tried to look for alternative designs that can help run our clinical trials more efficiently. And so an adaptive design has been proposed as one alternative approach to conducting clinical trials. In an adaptive design, we pre-specify that we're going to look at our data early during the study and use this information to inform changes or modifications to the trial. To sort of add in this review and adapt loop into the clinical trial process. And this has a number of advantages. It can help us save time and resources and also prevent patients from being needlessly randomised. And it's because of these advantages, adaptive designs are becoming more popular in practice. And so an example of an adaptive trial might be planning to look at the data halfway through the study to see if we've got enough evidence at that point to stop the trial early, so then we can move on to the next stage of the process. It might be thinking about revising our sample size calculation, or it might be about adding or dropping treatment arms based on the data collected so far. So it seems to me that the methods of health economics and adaptive designs are well established in their sort of own right and as their independent areas of research. And they both aim to increase the efficiency of healthcare decision making. But at the moment, the design and analysis of adaptive clinical trials seems to focus on demonstrating clinical effectiveness. And despite its importance in that healthcare decision making process, cost effectiveness isn't really being considered. And I thought there were 2 issues with this. Firstly, we could be compromising the accuracy of our health economic analyses by not thinking about any adjustments or maybe changes that we need to make to our analysis to reflect the fact that the data comes from an adaptive trial. But also, are we potentially missing opportunities to increase our efficiency even further by thinking about how health economics can be used in the design and analysis of the adaptive clinical trials? And so the research aim of my PhD was to think about how health economics can be used in the design and analysis of adaptive clinical trials with the aim of increasing the efficiency of our healthcare decision-making process. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to understand what currently happens in practice. How are we using health economics and adaptive designs together? And so to do this, I reviewed a number of different sources to identify clinical trials with an adaptive design and a pre-planned health economic analysis. And from these trials, I extracted information about how the health economics have been used in the design, analysis, and reporting of these trials. And so the full review is published in Value in Health, but what I wanted to do was highlight some of the key results that sort of helped to shape what came next in terms of the research. And so we actually identified 37 clinical trials that had an adaptive design and a health economic analysis. But we only really considered that 3 of these trials used health economics to inform the design of the trial. And in those trials where we thought it was necessary and appropriate, none of the trials seemed to adjust their health economic analysis to reflect the fact that the data came from an adaptive clinical trial. And in the 19 trials that reported results, we felt that the reporting was suboptimal. It didn't really discuss how the researchers handled the fact that the data was from an adaptive design, or make any reflections on lessons learned from the process of using health economics as part of the adaptive clinical trial. And so at this point, it was clear that the methods of adaptive designs and health economics are quite well established, but they're not really being used together in practice. And so I wanted to understand a little bit more about why this was the case. Why aren't we routinely using health economics in the design and analysis of our adaptive clinical trials? And so what I wanted to do was understand whether there were any particular barriers and perhaps practical, ethical issues, maybe methodological issues that were preventing these methods being used in practice. And so I conducted a qualitative study that aimed to explore the attitudes of key stakeholders towards the use of health economics in the design and analysis of adaptive clinical trials. And so by using interviews and focus groups with members of the public, researchers and decision makers, I was able to ask them what their views were on the use of these methods and were there any particular concerns, barriers or opportunities that these types of designs presented. So in total, I interviewed 29 participants with a fairly even split between the members of the public and the researchers and decision makers. So to analyse all this data that I collected, I used what's known as a framework analysis, which helped me to categorise the data and sort of recognise when maybe key ideas were being repeated in each of the interviews. And I found that I could nicely structure and summarise the results into 3 broad categories relating to ethical issues, such as what should the main aim of a clinical trial be? Methodological issues, such as how do we maintain the accuracy of our health economic analysis following an adaptive trial, but also, and particularly from the sort of research and decision makers, practical issues around how we're actually going to be able to use these methods in practice and how does this fit with current funding structures and the way that we currently run our clinical trials. So again, I'm just going to present some of the key results from this study. The full results have been published in Trials, but I'm just going to pick out 3 key results that stood out and really helped to inform which direction I took the methods research in next. And so it was really clear from the majority of the stakeholders in the qualitative study that they felt clinical effectiveness should be the main aim of a clinical trial. Many of the stakeholders understood and sort of acknowledged the fact that cost effectiveness is really important and it can't be avoided because we have limited budget. We can't fund every treatment and we can't conduct every single clinical trial. But they felt that a shift too far away from demonstrating clinical effectiveness to focus on cost effectiveness wouldn't necessarily reflect what they felt was important in the trial. And again, reflecting the results from the review, there was a clear lack of awareness about the impact that an adaptive design might have on a health economic analysis, which is potentially concerning if we're conducting health economic analyses with data from adaptive trials without an appreciation for any adjustments that might need to be made. The final thing that really stood out was that for those stakeholders that were part of funding panels, it seemed that they quite often use informal rules of thumb when making decisions about the cost effectiveness of a research proposal. They might have in their mind that if a clinical trial, a multi-centre trial costs £1 million, that's really good value for money. But if a small observational study with 100 participants is £1 million, that maybe doesn't represent as good value for money. And so they're sort of informally using these cost effectiveness type decisions when they're thinking about whether a particular grant application should be funded. But it wasn't common for them to be using the methods of value of information to inform these decisions, which kind of formalise these types of considerations. And so I thought maybe there was an opportunity there to be thinking about how we use value of information analysis to guide the design of our clinical trials and our adaptive design. So like I've said, the methods of adaptive designs and health economics were quite well established in their own right, but they weren't being used together in practice. And the key thing that I wanted to focus on next was this issue of a lack of awareness about the impact that an adaptive design might have on a health economic analysis. And so the reason that I was so concerned about this was because as adaptive designs become more popular and they're more routinely used in our health technology assessments and to sort of design and conduct our clinical trials, they're more and more likely to be providing data for a health economic analysis. And we know from the research literature that we can't just use the same analysis methods following an adaptive design as we would had the trial been sort of a fixed design trial, because there's potential to introduce bias into that analysis. But at the moment, if the health economist or the research team isn't aware of this issue, they could be conducting a health economic analysis, not reflecting the fact that data comes from an adaptive trial, and then draw inaccurate conclusions about the cost effectiveness of an intervention. And that information could then be used by decision makers such as NICE to fund a particular intervention which isn't truly cost effective, and this potentially wastes resources, which is obviously to the detriment of patients. And so what I wanted to do was to try and understand this issue a little more and think about how we need to handle the bias from an adaptive design in our health economic analysis. So I decided to focus on the group sequential design. So this is a type of adaptive trial and is actually the most commonly used adaptive design in practice. And so it seemed a good place to start because if lots of group sequential designs are being conducted, they're potentially providing data to lots of health economic analyses. I also decided to focus on this trial design because there's quite a good body of evidence in the research literature around the bias that might be introduced following the group sequential design. And importantly, there are methods that exist to control and adjust for this that I could build upon and think about in the health economic context. So in a group sequential design, we examine the accumulating data after groups of patients have reached our outcome of interest. And commonly, as we sort of highlighted in the review, the outcome of interest is generally focused on demonstrating clinical effectiveness. And so what we do is we essentially pre-specify that we're going to look at our data early and use this to inform a stopping rule, which helps us to decide at that point in the trial whether we have sufficient information to stop the trial early. So we might decide to stop the trial early for efficacy, or we might decide to stop the trial early for futility. Our treatment maybe isn't working as well as we expected, and so we can sort of stop the trial, stop investing money in that treatment and use those resources elsewhere. So like I've mentioned, it's quite well documented that the analysis following a group sequential design requires careful consideration. So we know that our treatment effect estimate, so the point estimate of our clinical outcome, is likely to be biased when we're using a group sequential design. And this might be biased upwards if we've stopped early for efficacy, and it might be biased downwards if we're stopping early for futility. And there are also implications as well for our confidence interval. So our interval might not have those sort of desirable properties that we really look for, such as containing the maximum likelihood estimate, and also having the sort of coverage that we expect for an interval. But importantly, this bias will extend to secondary outcomes when they're correlated with the primary outcome. And quite often when we conduct a health economic analysis, we will collect data that's useful for that analysis as part of the clinical trial, typically as secondary outcomes of the study. So we might collect information about changes to a patient's quality of life over the duration of a trial, and we might collect information about the types of resources that they've used and the costs that they've incurred during the study. And it's quite reasonable to expect that these outcomes will be correlated with a clinical primary outcome. So if we imagine a clinical trial where we've developed a new drug that can reduce the number of asthma exacerbations that a patient has. So our clinical endpoint is related to asthma exacerbations. But if a patient experiences a reduction in their asthma exacerbations, then this is likely to have a positive impact on their quality of life because they may be able to do certain day-to-day tasks that they weren't able to do previously. So there will be correlation between the clinical outcome and the quality of life outcome used in a health economic analysis. And likewise, if they're sort of finding an improvement in their asthma, they may not incur as many costs during the study, because they might not need to go to the GP as often, and they may not need to be admitted to hospital as often as they would have previously. So again, it's reasonable to expect that there might be correlation between the clinical outcome and the cost outcome, the health economic outcome. And so this potentially means that if we're using the data from an adaptive clinical trial to inform a health economic analysis, we could potentially be introducing bias into that cost effectiveness analysis. And so we need to be thinking about what adjustments are appropriate and required for a health economic analysis following an adaptive trial. And so fortunately, there are bias adjustment methods that exist in the context of group sequential design that we can use and we can draw upon to think about what adjustments are appropriate for our health economic analysis. So I've decided to focus on the bias adjusted maximum likelihood estimate. And so this estimate works by taking our maximum likelihood estimate of our primary outcome and subtracting an estimate of the bias to give us the bias adjusted maximum likelihood estimate. And there is also an equivalent adjustment for a secondary outcome collected as part of the trial. So again, we take our maximum likelihood estimate and subtract some estimate of the bias, which depends on the bias in our primary outcome and the correlation between the primary and secondary outcome in the trial. So what I wanted to do was to think about how I can extend these bias-adjusted methods to the health economic context, because I found that currently in the literature, there is no real consideration of this bias or the necessary bias adjustments in the context of the health economic analysis, which potentially explains why in the review and in the qualitative study, there was sort of a lack of awareness of the necessary adjustments following our adaptive trials. And so I wanted to think about a within trial health economic analysis that uses data collected as part of the trial, but also a model-based health economic analysis that will likely use data from the clinical trial relating to costs and quality of life, but may also use information relating to the primary outcome and other clinical outcomes that were maybe secondary outcomes in the trial. And so I wanted to understand what happens if we didn't adjust our analysis at all to reflect the fact that the trial was adaptive, and what happens if we use the bias adjusted maximum likelihood estimate approach to adjust our point estimates and our confidence intervals. And so by using a simulation study, I conducted the unadjusted and adjusted analyses and made comparisons between the two. But I was also interested in what effect varying different trial characteristics would have on the level of bias and maybe how well the adjustments work. And so I looked at the correlation between the primary and health economic outcomes. And I also looked at whether the stopping rule had an impact on the level of bias as well. So I looked at the Pocock stopping rule and the O'Brien-Fleming stopping rule. And I was also interested in whether the number of analyses that we conducted during the study had an impact as well. So I looked at 2 analyses, so 1 interim and a final analysis, and up to 5 analyses. So that's up to 4 interim analyses and a final analysis as well. And so to put the simulation study into context, I based the simulation of the trial data on the Cactus pilot trial. And so the Cactus trial looked at whether a computer-based intervention for speech and language therapy could help improve the word naming ability of patients who had aphasia following a stroke. And the pilot trial looked to assess whether it was feasible to conduct a full-scale randomized controlled trial comparing the computer-based intervention to usual care. And so the trial had 28 participants, and as part of this analysis, there was a health economic model constructed and a health economic analysis carried out. And so what I imagined in a simulation study that I was simulating the full-scale trial with the 2 treatment arms and looking at the within trial and model-based health economic analysis following the group sequential design. So I'm just going to focus on the within trial analysis results at the moment. And so in this figure, we can see that we've got standardized bias on our y-axis. We've got each of the different designs considered in the columns of the figure. So we've got our fixed design trial that doesn't require any adjustment because there are no early examinations of the data. And then we've got our 4 adaptive trials. So the first row relates to the primary outcome. Second is the cost data collected during the trial. The third row is quality adjusted life year. So this is a measure of the quality and quantity of life experienced by a participant over the course of the study, and the incremental net benefit. So I'm just going to focus on the final row at the moment. So the incremental net benefit is calculated using data on the costs of an intervention and the quality of the intervention. And when an incremental net benefit is positive, this suggests that our computer-based intervention is cost effective or could be cost effective. And when the incremental net benefit is less than 0, this suggests that our computer-based intervention is unlikely to be cost effective. And so in this figure, we can see that as the correlation increases and gets closer to 1, the bias in our unadjusted point estimate, so in our estimate that ignores the fact that the data comes from an adaptive trial, increases quite steeply. But the bias in our adjusted estimate that uses the bias adjusted maximum likelihood estimate, it does increase slightly, but it's much less. There's much less bias in this estimate when we use the adjusted estimate. And so in actual fact, for the Pocock stopping rule, with 5 analyses, the bias is highest. And in this, for this particular design, when the correlation was greater than 0.8, I found that the unadjusted analysis gave a positive incremental net benefit. So we would draw conclusions that the computer-based intervention is cost effective, whereas the adjusted estimate that reflects the fact the data came from an adaptive trial was actually negative. And so we can see that by not adjusting our analysis, we're potentially drawing the wrong conclusion about the cost effectiveness of the computer-based intervention. And so I think this simulation study has highlighted the fact that there is actually quite a big potential for an adaptive design to introduce bias into a health economic analysis. And if we fail to recognise that and make appropriate adjustments, we're potentially introducing bias into our cost effectiveness analysis and subsequently the decisions that we make about whether a treatment should be made available to patients. And so I sort of identified that there was perhaps a lack of awareness about the impact that an adaptive design can have on a health economic analysis. And in the simulation study, I've been able to show that there is a clear potential for an adaptive design to introduce bias if we don't make appropriate bias adjustments. But what we can do is take that existing literature on bias adjustments in the group sequential design setting and extend this to the health economic context to maintain the accuracy of our health economic analysis following a group sequential design. But this was sort of just one part of my original research aim. So that helped us to think about maintaining the accuracy of our health economic analysis. But I also wanted to think about what opportunities existed to use health economics more as part of the design and analysis of an adaptive trial to help increase the efficiency of our healthcare decision making and our health technology assessment. But what I found from the qualitative study was that there seemed to be some reluctance to focus too much on cost effectiveness, especially during the trial. So participants in the qualitative study were maybe a little bit wary about having cost effectiveness inform adaptations or changes to the trial, maybe over and above clinical effectiveness. And so what I've tried to do is think about perhaps a compromise that says, well, can we use health economics to help guide our trial? But once the trial is actually set up and running, we're only focusing on clinical effectiveness. So we're using perhaps clinical effectiveness stopping rules as part of a group sequential design to decide when the trial stops early. But the choice of which stopping rule we could use is informed by health economics and thinking about the cost effectiveness of the different research design. And so this is where I really drew on the methods of value of information analysis. So briefly, value of information analysis allows researchers to think about and calculate the cost effectiveness of research. And so it helps them to think about how uncertain they are about making a particular resource allocation decision. So whether a treatment should be made available to patients or not. And think about whether it would be valuable to conduct further research to help reduce this decision uncertainty. But obviously, conducting a clinical trial isn't free. It can cost quite a lot of money. And so again, we need to make an assessment of the benefits of conducting that trial and compare that to the costs associated with conducting the trial in practice to decide whether it's actually cost effective to spend our limited budget in that way. And so there are a few different calculations that we can make under the value of information analysis framework. For example, we can calculate the expected value of perfect information, which essentially quantifies, which thinks about, could we eliminate all of our decision uncertainty, and thinks about whether any research is worthwhile. Or we can calculate the expected value of sample information, which thinks about eliminating some of our decision uncertainty. And it's the EVSI, and that is the focus of my research. And so we might be thinking about the best design or the most cost-effective design for our future clinical trial, because we want to reduce our decision uncertainty about whether to fund a particular drug on the NHS. We know we won't be able to eliminate all of our uncertainty, but it would help us to reduce it. And so we can calculate the expected value of sample information for different potential designs for this trial. For example, we might consider the EVSI for a trial design with 10 participants, 100, maybe 500 participants. And so it might be that the trial design with 500 participants gives us the greatest EVSI, the highest expected value of information. But we also need to think about costs, because a trial with 500 participants is likely to be quite costly. And so is it worthwhile conducting a trial with 500 participants, given the costs that will incur, or maybe a trial design with slightly fewer participants may still be a more cost-effective way to spend our resources. And so what we can do is we can calculate what's known as the expected net benefit of sampling. And so this takes our expected value of sample information and sort of scales it up to the population level and thinks about what costs will be incurred to conduct that particular research design in practice. And so we can calculate the expected net benefit of sampling for a range of different designs. So in our example, for a range of different sample sizes for the proposed trial. And we might find that while the design with 500 participants helps to reduce our uncertainty the most, it also costs us the most money. And by having perhaps a design with 250 participants, we can still learn quite a lot and reduce our decision uncertainty, but we save almost, well, a huge amount of resources by not having 500 participants, by having half the number of participants in the study. And so in actual fact, the design with 250 participants might have the highest expected net benefit of sampling. And so what we would usually do is calculate the expected net benefit of sampling for a range of designs, and then pick the design with the highest expected net benefit of sampling. And so the methods of expected value of sample information have been used and are used to help guide the design of clinical trials. But I wanted to think about how we could extend this approach to guide the design of our adaptive clinical trials, specifically the group sequential design. And so I wanted to think about what extra steps, what extra considerations would be required for us to use these methods in the context of adaptive trials. And so the first thing was to think about what adjustments would be necessary to reflect the fact that the data comes from an adaptive trial, because I'd shown in the simulation study that there is potential for bias to be introduced if we don't make appropriate adjustments. And I also wanted to make sure that we were accurately capturing the costs and potential cost savings of our adaptive trials. So our adaptive design might incur some additional costs over and above the fixed design trial, because we have some extra analyses during the study, which obviously don't come for free and incur resource costs, but also any potential cost savings. So an adaptive design might have a smaller expected sample size, which means that we need to randomize fewer participants and save the potential costs of randomizing participants during the study. So they were the two key considerations that really needed some extra consideration when we're thinking about the EVSI methods to guide the design of an adaptive trial. So again, I wanted to think about how I could operationalize this approach in the context of a real-world clinical trial, so that I could make useful recommendations to researchers thinking about this approach in practice. And so again, I drew on the Cactus case study. So in actual fact, following the Cactus pilot trial, a full-scale study was conducted called the Big Cactus trial, But I wanted to imagine that we were at the end of the cactus pilot and we were thinking about the most appropriate design for our full-scale study, where we would compare the computer-based intervention to usual care in a full-scale trial. And so in the actual cactus pilot, there was an EVPI calculation, so expected value of perfect information, that suggested that it was worthwhile conducting further research. And so I wanted to calculate the expected value of sample information and expected net benefit of sampling for a range of different designs, thinking about a fixed sample size design and the group sequential designs that I considered in the simulation study. So comparing the two group sequential stopping rules and varying number of interim analyses during the study. So in this figure, we've got the expected net benefit of sampling on the y-axis, and each row represents a different level of correlation imposed in the data simulation, because I was interested in what impact that might have on the bias in the analysis. So what I've got is adjusted expected net benefit of sampling for the adaptive designs and the unadjusted expected net benefit of sampling for the fixed design, because obviously there's no need to adjust for the fixed sample size design. And so the first set of points, so focus on the bottom row, the intervention cost was £769, reflecting the costs based on the cactus pilot. And in this case, for our two-arm full-scale trial, the expected net benefit of sampling was highest for our fixed sample size design. And so this was because the fixed design gave us the sort of highest expected value of sample information. It also gave us the highest expected cost, sort of the cost of sampling, but this didn't outweigh the sort of extra benefit that we got from the fixed sample size design. So that what I was then interested in was trying to understand when the adaptive designs might be more cost effective in this particular setting. And so I increased the cost of the computer-based intervention up to 15 times the original cost. And so we can see on the x-axis, the intervention costs are increasing. And when the intervention cost gets to sort of around 10 times that original intervention cost, that's where the adaptive designs really start to come into play in terms of being the most cost-effective design for that particular trial. And the reason is that although they give us slightly less in terms of expected value sample information, it's now so much more expensive to randomise a new participant into the study that the larger expected sample size for the fixed design trial gives it a very high cost of sampling. And so it's sort of almost not worthwhile having more participants because it costs so much to randomise participants into the study. Whereas the adaptive designs have a lower expected sample size and so can make those cost savings and making the trial more worthwhile. So I think what I've been able to show is that the expected value of sample information and expected net benefit of sampling methods can be extended to guide the design of a group sequential trial, and they can be used as part of the toolkit that research teams might consider when choosing the most appropriate design for their trial. I don't think I'm expecting that this would be the sole thing that's considered by a research team. There are obviously a lot of other factors that go into the design of a clinical trial. But this approach could be helpful in terms of providing a justification for a particular adaptive design, or perhaps a justification for not using an adaptive design in a particular context. And so what hopefully I've been able to show is that there is an opportunity to use health economics to guide the design of an adaptive trial and use these methods as part of that toolkit, like I said, that researchers can use as part of the design of a clinical trial that considers both cost effectiveness as well as clinical effectiveness considerations. So I've tried to use this work to inform some recommendations that might be useful to researchers and research teams that are thinking about using health economics in their adaptive design. And so in terms of designing these trials, I think the key thing to sort of focus on is the fact that many of the participants in the qualitative study felt that clinical effectiveness should be the main aim of a clinical trial, and that really this needs to be reflected in the methods development in this area, and also in the methods that we're using in our clinical trial. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be using cost effectiveness considerations during a trial. I think there are potentially quite good opportunities to be thinking about cost effectiveness of the research and also of a particular intervention at an interim analysis of an adaptive trial. But maybe we just need to think carefully about how we use that information. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to have a hierarchy of stopping rules where we perhaps think about clinical effectiveness considerations first, and then based on the outcome of that clinical analysis, are there any extra modifications to the study or perhaps changes that can be informed by the cost effectiveness considerations as well. And I think the real key thing to make sure we get this right is to involve members of the public in these design type decisions. So helping them to inform the design of a trial, asking them would they feel comfortable being a participant in these types of trials, and how comfortable they feel with decisions made on cost effectiveness in the proposed way. I think there are a few more things that need to happen before we can routinely implement these trials in practice, and this is really sort of highlighted in the qualitative study. We need to think about how we're going to train our researchers. So this is training our health economists and statisticians to implement these methods and use these, maintain the accuracy of their analyses, but also thinking about those researchers that sit on funding panels or maybe health technology appraisal committees who need to be able to interpret and understand the methods and results from these studies so that they can be used appropriately in practice. At the moment, I think under the current funding structures, it might be quite difficult to use these types of designs because there's probably going to need to be a big chunk of work conducted before the trial even gets funded to appropriately design and spend the time thinking about how the health economics can be used to design the study and during the trial. And at the moment, those opportunities aren't really there, but perhaps having smaller pots of money to help research teams design efficient trials could be a kind of cost-effective way to spend our research budget. And I think one thing that would be really helpful to help researchers maintain the accuracy of their health economic analyses will be to update guidance documents such as the NICE Guide to Technology Appraisals to sort of highlight the fact that an adaptive design might impact their health economic analysis and point them towards resources that will help them to make sure that even when we're using an adaptive design, our cost effectiveness analysis isn't compromised. I think a really key thing that comes out of this work is the fact that the adaptive design can have an impact on our health economic analysis and can introduce bias. And so it's really important that we are aware of the fact that this can happen and we're using appropriate adjustments along the way. And so we need to be presenting adjusted and unadjusted analyses with a clear description of the methods that have been used to sort of get those estimates. And this reflects some of the guidance in the recent Adaptive Designs Consort extension that says we need to be reporting clearly the adjustment methods so that researchers can interpret results appropriately, and it's clear that considerations have been made for the fact that data comes from an adaptive trial. So just to conclude, I think that using health economics in adaptive clinical trials has the potential to improve current practice and help us to conduct clinical trials and sort of our healthcare decision making more efficiently. But it's really important that we're aware of the fact that an adaptive design can impact a health economic analysis and that we're making appropriate adjustments so that we're not sort of destroying those advantages of the adaptive design by having a subsequent health economic analysis that's inaccurate and is biased. So it's really important that we're thinking about what adjustments we need to make to our health economic analyses. In terms of using health economics more to guide the design and the analysis of adaptive trials, I think we want to be reflecting the fact that clinical effectiveness is important to stakeholders. And one compromise that I presented today was thinking about how health economics can be used to guide the design of a trial, which is then focused on clinical effectiveness in terms of the interim analyses and adaptations that are made once the trial is running. But I think there is more work to do, and we need to think carefully about whether we have enough training and how we train our researchers. So thinking about case studies, maybe software to help implement these approaches, and making sure that we have enough resources to be able to do this in practice. But if we can get all of this right, I think we can use health economics in the design and analysis of adaptive clinical trials to increase the efficiency of our health technology assessment, but importantly, doing this without compromising accuracy. Thank you.
Hi, Laura. Thanks so much. That was excellent, that presentation. I think it's really, there's some really great practical tips in there and kind of examples, bringing it back to practice. And also, it's really glad to hear your recommendations about including the public and trial design. I think that's very interesting from your perspective. We have a couple of questions that have come in. I'd just also like, before I put them to you, to remind everyone, if you have any more questions at home, if you could put them in the Q&A box there or in the chat box either at the bottom of the screen. So one of the questions, Laura, was in the simulation study, how was the model-based analysis affected by the adaptive design?
Okay, yeah, so obviously I've focused on the within trial analysis and the presentation, but I did also look at what impacts there would be on the model-based analysis. So what I found was that in the context of the Cactus sort of trial setting and the Cactus health economic model, I found that the bias was much more reduced when I used a sort of more realistic simulation of the data. So thinking about realistic correlations between primary and health economic outcomes. And also that sort of by the time we've put all that data through the health economic model, our model-based incremental net benefit was much less biased than compared to the within trial analysis that I presented. But I think we have to be a bit careful because that's quite heavily dependent on the context of the trial and specifically how the data is used in the health economic model. So in the Cactus model, we don't directly use the primary outcome, for example. We use other summaries of that primary outcome data, which maybe explains why we don't get the high levels of bias that we saw in the within trial analysis. So my recommendation would be still to adjust your model-based analysis to reflect the fact that it's come from a group sequential design. You might find that when you've done both analyses that there isn't much difference between the adjusted and unadjusted analysis, but you can't know that in advance, and so we're kind of gambling a little bit if we just make a recommendation that you don't need to adjust a model-based analysis. I think it's really important to present both and kind of be aware of the potential impact.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another question that's come in now is, well, statement first saying thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And this person wonders if you could say a little more about what is assumed about treatment effects in the simulations and in the EVSI calculation. E.g., are they assumed to be homogeneous over time, and what if there were cumulative effects or delayed short-lived effects?
So I think simple answer would be that I've just assumed that it's constant over time. But I'd be happy if that person wants to get in touch to sort of explain a little bit more detail about what exactly I've done. It'd be great to get more opinions on whether I've made some sort of oversimplifications and look at more realistic concepts.
Yeah, okay, and that's okay if they contact you. We've also been asked if you wouldn't mind sharing these slides. Would that be possible?
Yeah, I think that should be okay.
Yeah, we're going to put this presentation up online on our website anyway, but just there was a couple of people that asked at the beginning of the presentation if they'd be available. So Laura, in terms of other research, do you have any plans for what's next?
Yeah, so I do actually have a slide with a few projects that I'm working on at the moment. So as we mentioned at the start, I'm working on the Economics of Adaptive Clinical Trials project. So this is a project with York and University in Verona and INSEAD in France. And so we're thinking about this idea of cost effectiveness stopping rules during the trial, but with a real focus on the practical implementation of this. So we're thinking in the context of our NIHR funded trials, how would we actually conduct and use these methods? Because I think at the moment in the review, it was clear that these methods aren't being used, and there are some sort of barriers and hurdles that need to be overcome before a research team can say, okay, well, this method's appropriate, and I know how to handle that in my particular trial. So that's kind of the focus of the ENACT project. I'm also working with a couple of other groups. So I've been working with Munya Demiro in Sheffield, who has been developing a practical adaptive novel designs and analysis toolkit, so Panda, which is an online platform that thinks about is providing resources on adaptive trials and training for researchers interested in learning more about adaptive trials. And also I'm working with some researchers as part of the Adaptive Designs working group on costing adaptive trials. And so I think at the moment, this is one of the sort of challenges that researchers face when they're putting together a grant application that's thinking about an adaptive trial. How do we make sure that we capture the costs of all the different scenarios that could happen during an adaptive trial? How do we capture that in our grant application and sort of convince funders that this is we know what we're doing in terms of costs and in terms of the money that they provide to the research team. And this is really important when you're thinking about the cost effectiveness of research, both to guide the design of a trial, but also if you were thinking about cost effectiveness of the research during the study. At the moment, there's no real clear guidance for research teams thinking about costing their adaptive trials. So I think that'd be a really important piece of research that helps guide the methods research as well as the practical.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks so much, Laura. That was really, really good. We've had a good response and a good number of people listening in. So as I say, this webinar will be available as a recording on our website, hopefully this evening or tomorrow. And then people can look back over it again if they want to hear it again. And I believe, are your contact details on these slides, Laura? Or we
no, but I can add them to the version that's sent around, so we can.
Perfect, that would be great. So thanks very much again. And I'd just like to just let everyone listening to the webinar today know that there is a special symposium coming up next week, which is the 30th of June and the 1st of July, and it's called Trials in the Pandemic, Embracing Flexibility and Ensuring Integrity. It's an online conference, it's free to join. So what this is a collaboration between the Health Research Board, TMRN in Ireland and Galway, and UCD, which is University College Dublin, in collaboration with partners in Trial Forge at the University of Aberdeen. And they're going to welcome some of the world's leading experts, beg your pardon, currently working in all different aspects of COVID-19 trials. So that would be really interesting to join into that as well. So so far, there's a huge response to that online, but if anyone else wants to join, they're very welcome to, and there will be a link on our website. So again, thank you again, Laura, and best of luck with your upcoming Viva. And I think your work's really, really valuable, and it's adding a huge amount, especially now when everyone's so conscious of cost in trials. So thanks again, Laura.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for listening in. Thank you.